Hi there, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to rack gear on your harness. And the first thing I'd like to show is how you can bring your gear to the crag. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and for the most part this has very little to do with safety and a lot to do with preference. So it's nice to try out a few different systems and see really what suits you and your climbing style, especially if you like to climb corners or offwits. You might decide to rack a little differently depending on what you're climbing that day. So first, this is how I brought my gear to the crag today. I used to really like racking on a Dyneema runner, the same type of runner that I was going to use for extending on the pitch of climbing I was doing. But these days I'm using smaller packs, I'm climbing more alpine routes, and I find I can pack more compactly in smaller backpacks if I compose my gear of small clumps and then compress them inside of my pack. I also find it's still pretty easy to rack off this and get organized using some of the systems for racking. So here on the left-hand side, I have my medium to large cams, so 0.75 up to number 3, all racked on the number 3, the largest cam. Here I have my nuts, so the smallest pieces of protection, all the way up to a 0.5 Camelot. And then I have just a small cluster of single length runners and quick draws. Today the routes we're doing are really short, so we don't need a lot of extension. This isn't a rack that I recommend for all routes, but this is what I brought out today. And for a better look at trad climbing racks, take a look at our video called Trad Climbing Racks. And then today I've got bolted anchors, so I'm just bringing a pre-constructed quad out of a 180 centimeter runner with 2 non-locking carabiners attached to it. So one of the things I like about this is my preferred way of racking involves gates out. Okay, so when I clip these to my harness, you'll see the gates are going to be facing out on my carabiners, and 2 carabiners that are the same, so 2 number 1 Camelots, for example, will be clipped to each other. So I can quickly grab a bunch like this, and I can pull off my 2 0.75 Camelots. It's easy for me to see how many I brought because they're clipped together. And all the medium and large Camelots, or pieces of protection, whatever I happen to bring that day, are going to be going on my left-hand side. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm right-handed, so I tend to like a little bit more coordination when I'm placing my smaller cams, and so I place them with my right hand. So my small cams are on my left, or excuse me, on my right hip, because I'm right-handed, and my larger cams are on my left hip, which requires less coordination to place. And one of the reasons for that is because typically when the crack is larger, it's easier climbing, so I'm not as concerned about using my left hand at that time. Okay, so I can quickly and efficiently just take these straight off, and I'm going from my smallest medium-sized cams, which is my 0.75 cam, in the front, and then to my largest in the back, which is going to be my blue number 3 Camelot. Okay, so just like this, and back here. Another thing that's really nice about this racking system, other than how quickly you can rack your harness up and how easily you can see what you've got, is that it takes up less room on your harness than racking these individually. Half as much room. Okay, and that can become advantageous if you're climbing long pitches that require more protection, or really difficult pitches that you want to protect well because it's small pro and you don't feel comfortable having pieces as far apart. Okay, so that's nice. Another big advantage of this system is when I'm climbing, if I put a 0.75 Camelot in a crack and I'm not sure if I've got another one, all I have to do is look down and I can see whether that slot for my 0.75 Camelot is empty. In some other systems where you rack one green on this side and then another green on my right side, then I might have to look at my left hip and my right hip if I forgot what I placed on the portion of the pitch that I've already protected. Okay, so I rock just like so. I'm going to put my quick draws on my right hip. A lot of times harder climbing is protected by the quick draws on a mixed climb. And by mixed climb here, I'm just talking about a mix of trad and sport gear. I'll put my single length runners. I oftentimes will have them clipped in bunches of 4, so if I carry 8 runners, a lot of times I will have 4 on my left hip and 4 on my right. And I like to clip those just behind. And you can see I don't have to use these back loops here at all because it all fits well. And that's nice if I end up doing chimneying or something like that, because I can free these back loops a little bit more easily because I'm not using as much of my space on my gear loops. Flipping over to the other side, I'm going to start with my nuts, and nuts, even though they're small pro, usually I go from smallest to largest. Nuts are an exception. I'm going to put those in the far back because I find if I clip them to the front, sometimes they'll drag along the rock and they're more likely to actually get stuck and self-place in the rock while I'm climbing, and that makes upward progress pretty difficult. So I'm going to clip that back here where it's pretty accessible still, but I can shove it back and out of the way. Okay, and then I'm going to continue with smallest to largest cams as I go back. So I've got my 0.5 is the largest cam on my right hip. Then I've got my 0.4s. One of those is a gray alien, which is a similar size. And then a 0.3. And then finally a green alien. And because I'm using the gates out away method, when these are clipped into each other, you'll notice this carabiner is on the gate side. So it can be quickly clipped in and clipped out and clipped in. If it was clipped on this side here, on the spine side of the carabiner, it makes removing that a little bit more difficult because of the way I have to reorient that carabiner to access. Okay, so those are all good considerations when racking. And then finally, my pre-constructed quad anchor, I'm going to just put that on my back left hip. And I typically will always have things racked in the same way if the pitch of climbing is not a specialty pitch. It's not a pitch of off-width climbing, it's not a chimney climb, and I'm going to discuss some considerations for both of those in my next little clip. Okay, this next technique that I'm going to show is ideal if you're climbing pitches of off-width. And off-width cracks tend to be larger cracks that you might be able to fit one side of your body in, but not your entire body, in which case it would become a chimney. So here I've racked my larger cams on a sling, and I've just chosen to use a piece of sewn tubular webbing for this. You could have a designated gear sling. I typically don't use those unless I'm aid climbing, and I'll be using this technique for a lot of pitches, but it's personal preference here. And I've got my large cams over here from largest to smallest again, starting with a number 6, number 5, 2 number 4s, and 2 number 3s. I may also put some of the smaller gear on my harness, just depends. And I've got my slings on my harness. I may have these on my harness, or I may have these up on my sling on my chest. In this case, usually by having these clipped together on my harness, I find I can move them around well enough, and still I'll be able to climb the crack without things getting jammed. One of the advantages of this sling is that, you know, if I start climbing left side in, if I had things on my harness, there's not a lot of room for those items to move, and if it's on the left side of my hip, it can get jammed quite easily. The sling, if this gets against the side of the crack, I can simply push it back and out of the way to my back, and that'll allow me to still climb. So that's a good consideration if you happen to be climbing pitches of off-width. Okay, this is what I would call sort of the classic way of racking, where you have equal parts on one side as the other. So I've got my smallest pieces, green alien. The modern green alien is almost equal to a 0.3 Camelot. So I'm starting with my smallest cam, and I'm working my way back to my slightly larger cam, pardon me, with my purple. This guy's out of order here. Green, red, yellow, and blue. So one of the advantages of this sort of classic or balanced technique here is I may not know whether I'm going to place with my left hand or my right hand as I climb up. So I might try to place a purple with my left hand, or I might try to place purple with my right hand, and it allows me to do both. The disadvantage is once I use one of these purples, if I come up to a spot that the crack is wide enough for a purple size cam, I may have forgotten that I used the purple cam on my left hip and now it's over here on my right. So sometimes it can take a little bit longer and require a little bit more mental energy to remember that when you're placing. So usually I find these things are mostly a matter of preference, and then once you develop something that works well for you, the more practiced you get, the less effort it will take for you to be able to place those cams and identify which cams are missing. This final technique that I'm showing for racking your gear on your harness is ideal if you're climbing a pitch of chimney climbing, which is, you know, wide enough that your entire body can fit inside, and oftentimes you need to press against one wall with your back or your butt and the other wall with your feet and your hands. So I've used my favorite technique for racking gear, which is clipping pieces that are the same to each other. Okay, so reds to reds, yellows to yellows, and so on and so forth on both sides. And that takes up less space on my harness. You'll notice I've also cleared everything off the back of my harness here. I've got just a little emergency kit clipped on there, and I may decide to move that as well if there's going to be a lot of pure chimneying. And one of the difficulties of chimneying is if it happens to be on a multi-pitch route and you have a small pack. So one thing that you can do, other than moving your gear forward, if you want to be more comfortable, is when you get to the start of that chimney pitch, you can take your backpack off and you can clip it in to your belay loop. Okay, so you can use a single length or a double length runner for that. I find a double length or 120 centimeter runner keeps it down a little bit further out of the way of my feet. So some people use locking carabiners for this. Other people use non-lockers. If you drop your backpack, just think about the consequences when you decide how secure this should really be. Okay, so I'm just gonna go with some non-lockers here, and I clip that directly into my belay loop and I let that hang down. And with this double length runner, it hangs far enough out of the way I can climb up a little bit, get myself secure, and then I can grab a hold of this and pull it up a little bit if I've wedged myself in the chimney. And then once I get through that difficult section of chimney climbing, I'll often pull my backpack up and then put it back on. And keep in mind, if there's two of you climbing, it may not be necessary for the leader to have a pack, and that can create better security for your lead climber. Maybe the lead climber just wants to clip a water bottle onto them or something else just for comfort for those one or two pitches, and then take the backpack back after they've gotten through those hard sections. Hopefully this has been really helpful for you guys, and consider the different methods for racking up your harness depending on the pitches of climbing you're doing and whether you be climbing single pitch or multi-pitch.